Betrayal isn't loud. It was the crackle of a fireplace in a silent Colorado lodge, where 40 expensive meals sat growing cold. My family chose my sister's lavish Aspen engagement over my wedding, assuming I would swallow the humiliation like I had for 31 years. But as my cake sat untouched, federal agents were raiding her perfect fiancé's office. The man exposing his fraudulent empire on national television was the husband they had just discarded. Hello, everyone. Before today's story begins, we'd like to share a quick message. YouTube recently removed our monetization, cutting off our income. If you enjoy this story, we humbly ask for just $1 to help pay our staff so they can make a living and keep creating for you. Thank you for saving us. Now, let's begin the story. My name is Piper Payne, and I am 31 years old. I stood perfectly still, shivering in the center of a rustic, timber-framed lodge nestled deep within the jagged, unforgiving peaks of Oakhaven, Colorado. Outside the frosted, floor-to-ceiling window panes, a massive, swirling blizzard was tearing fiercely through the ancient pine trees, burying the winding mountain roads under thick, heavy layers of blinding white snow. The wind howled a hollow, relentless tune, rattling the glass in its wooden frames. But the piercing chill I felt seeping into my bones had absolutely nothing to do with the brutal winter storm raging outdoors. It radiated directly from the 40 empty wooden folding chairs arranged in neat, expectant, curved rows right in front of me. Just last night, I had knelt on these cold hardwood floors, my fingers aching, stiff, and raw, carefully tying a perfectly measured sage green satin ribbon around every single backrest. Now, under the dim, yellow glow of the lodge chandeliers, those beautiful ribbons hung like colorful little nooses in a silent graveyard of abandonment. I was wearing a simple, long-sleeved ivory wedding gown, completely void of the extravagant, heavy crystal beads and stiff, suffocating lace my mother had always loudly insisted a proper bride needed. The unadorned silk fabric felt incredibly heavy against my skin as the absolute silence in the room stretched out, suffocating, dense, and unbearable. Out of the 40 carefully curated guests on my list, exactly 4 people were breathing the air inside this cavernous hall. There was the local mountain pastor, an older gentleman nervously shifting his weight from one foot to the other, his leather Bible clutched tightly against his chest as if to shield himself from the overwhelming awkwardness. There was the lodge manager, who kept compulsively wiping down the exact same spot on the polished wooden bar with a white rag, doing everything in his physical power to avoid making eye contact with me. There was a former cybersecurity colleague of my groom, standing rigidly by the brass coat rack near the entrance, and then, standing right beside me at the makeshift altar, there was Leo, my groom, my anchor. The deep, aching hollowness in my chest echoed back to a brief phone call from exactly 3 days ago. My mother had called me on a Tuesday evening, her voice dripping with an exaggerated, breathless panic that she always used when she was lying. She claimed the national weather forecasts were predicting an unprecedented, catastrophic storm front directly over Oakhaven. She insisted the roads would be entirely impassable, that it was simply too dangerous for the family to risk driving up the mountain, and that they were devastated to miss my big day. It was a practiced, pathetic, desperate lie. The truth did not require a seasoned meteorologist or a satellite map to uncover. The truth was glaringly bright on my phone screen, courtesy of a public Instagram story uploaded just 3 hours before my ceremony was scheduled to begin. There they all were, my mother, my father, my aunts, and my cousins, all dressed in shimmering designer evening wear. Throwing their heads back in laughter and clinking tall crystal flutes of expensive vintage champagne, they were perfectly safe, perfectly warm, and perfectly happy at a sprawling, 5-star luxury ski resort down in Aspen. They had actively chosen to attend my younger sister Chloe's extravagant, ostentatious engagement party over witnessing my wedding. They had traded my sacred vows for her high-end appetizers and a chance to rub elbows with the elite. Leo did not offer me a pitying gaze. He did not whisper hollow, meaningless comforts about how they might still be stuck in traffic, or how the weather really was quite bad, or how things would eventually get better. He simply walked over to me, his deliberate footsteps echoing loudly against the empty floorboards. He quietly slipped off his heavy, dark wool suit jacket and draped it over my bare, shivering shoulders. The fine fabric was immediately warm, lined with his body heat, smelling faintly of cedar wood, clean soap, and the crisp mountain air. He walked over to the small bar, took a heavy glass tumbler, poured 2 neat fingers of dark amber whiskey, and handed it to me. His eyes, calm, steady, and remarkably clear, met mine without a trace of hesitation. "We do not need a bad audience for a good movie," he said softly. I took the heavy glass from his hand. The sudden warmth of the strong liquor burned a harsh, necessary path down my throat, slowly thawing the thick block of ice that had formed around my heart over the last hour. I walked over to the small, 2-tiered vanilla wedding cake sitting on a lonely, white-clothed table in the corner of the room. Picking up a silver fork, I smoothly carved out a piece of the soft sponge, lifted it to my trembling lips, and took the very first bite of my wedding cake in absolute, defiant silence. With that single swallow, I finally truly accepted the harsh reality I had spent 3 decades trying to rationalize and ignore. My family had entirely erased me from their lives. I was no longer a daughter or a protective older sister. To them, I was nothing more than a ghost. As the sweet, creamy taste of vanilla frosting began to fade on my tongue, a sudden flash of frantic movement caught the corner of my eye. The small, flat-screen television mounted high above the lodge's reception desk was completely muted, but the screen was rapidly flashing with urgent red graphics. A bold, capitalized breaking news banner crawled aggressively across the bottom of the display. The shaky live aerial camera footage showed a sleek, towering, ultra-modern glass office building entirely surrounded by dozens of federal police cruisers. The swirling, chaotic blue and red emergency lights cut sharply through the dreary afternoon gloom, illuminating a massive swarm of heavily armed agents rushing violently through the shattered lobby doors. To fully comprehend how I ended up standing alone in that freezing lodge, you have to understand my specific utility to the Payne family ecosystem. I was never the cherished daughter. I was the designated janitor. By day, I worked as a senior data analyst at Veritas Freight Solutions, a mid-sized logistics company where my entire job consisted of staring at endless spreadsheets and finding practical efficiencies in messy shipping routes. By night, I served as the family's personal, endlessly patient financial life raft. When my mother maxed out 3 different premium credit cards on designer handbags and luxury spa retreats she absolutely could not afford, it was my paycheck that quietly covered the minimum balances to save her credit score. When my father required expensive out-of-pocket medical treatments because he stubbornly refused to pay for proper insurance, I drained my savings accounts to keep him healthy. My entire existence was engineered to be a sturdy, invisible foundation upon which my younger sister, Chloe, could safely perform her glamorous, carefully curated life. I was conditioned from a young age to step back, to shrink, and to gladly surrender the spotlight the moment she entered a room. Then came Vance. Chloe brought him home for a holiday dinner roughly 2 years ago, and he immediately ascended to the role of our family's new living deity. Vance proudly introduced himself as a visionary green tech billionaire, though the actual billions seemed entirely theoretical and perpetually just out of reach. He drove a brand new, top-of-the-line electric Tesla, wore immaculate cashmere turtlenecks, and spoke exclusively in the exhausting, empty buzzwords of Silicon Valley. Every family gathering quickly devolved into his personal seminar on venture capital pipelines, disruptive solar energy grids, and aggressive market capitalization. My parents swallowed every single syllable as if he were handing out winning lottery tickets. He was loud, he was shamelessly flashy, and he was the perfect glittering accessory for Chloe's heavily filtered, status-obsessed social media presence, in their eyes. Vance was the golden ticket that would finally elevate the Payne family name to the elite social circles they felt they inherently deserved. Right around that same time, I met Leo. Leo was an independent cybersecurity auditor. He spent his days hunting down critical vulnerabilities in massive corporate networks, methodically tearing apart digital infrastructure line by code line to find the truth hidden within the servers. He was a deeply quiet, intensely observant man who lived in a modest, hand-built log cabin just outside the noisy city limits. The very first time I brought Leo to a Sunday family dinner, he sat directly across from Vance. Vance spent 45 uninterrupted minutes aggressively bragging about his ghost investors and his supposedly revolutionary tech patents. Leo just sat there, methodically cutting his steak, watching Vance with the mild, detached fascination of a seasoned biologist observing a particularly loud, frantic insect. Leo possessed the rare, dangerous ability to see exactly who a person was beneath their performance, and he saw right through Vance's expensive veneer in roughly 10 seconds. Yet, he chose absolute silence. He did not argue. He did not try to prove himself to people who were already blind. Naturally, my family entirely misinterpreted his silence as weakness. They operated on a frequency that equated sheer volume with human value. To them, Leo was painfully ordinary, a boring technician who wasted his life nitpicking on computers in the dark. They openly sneered at his faded flannel shirts, his calloused hands, and his scuffed leather work boots. My mother once loudly asked him across the dinner table why he did not get a real job with a lucrative stock option package, gesturing wildly and admiringly toward Vance's perfectly manicured hands. They genuinely believed Leo's honest, meticulous labor was a pathetic, small-minded joke compared to Vance's million-dollar vision. Because I was the dependable, boring workhorse of the family, they assumed I had simply chosen another workhorse. We were the dull, gray backdrop meant to make Chloe and Vance shine even brighter. The final defining display of this toxic dynamic happened exactly 6 months ago. Leo and I had carefully saved our money, booked the mountain lodge in Colorado, and finalized our wedding date. Save the dates were mailed out. Non-refundable deposits were paid in full. Then, casually, over a lavish Sunday brunch that I was paying for, Chloe happily announced her engagement party. She had purposefully booked a luxury venue in Aspen for the exact same weekend as my wedding. When I stared at her, utterly paralyzed, waiting for the punchline of what had to be a cruel joke, my mother quickly slammed her hand down on the table to silence my rising protest. She looked me dead in the eye and delivered the final verdict with absolute, chilling conviction. Vance has extremely important international investors flying in that weekend, she said, her voice dripping with undeniable condescension. You are the older sister, Piper. You have to know how to sacrifice. My wedding, a modest gathering meant to celebrate my future, was immediately deemed an unacceptable distraction from the spectacular corporate mixer Vance and Chloe were hosting. I was fully expected to cancel my vendors, fold my dreams away, sweep up the emotional mess, and stand in the background to applaud my sister. I refused to change my date. Consequently, they refused to attend. The heavy silence of the mountain lodge was violently shattered by a harsh, mechanical buzzing. Deep inside the pocket of my silk gown, my cell phone began to vibrate with frantic, terrifying urgency. I pulled the device out, the screen illuminating my face with a harsh white glow. It was a relentless barrage of notifications. 32 missed calls from my mother, 17 from my father, and a rapid, continuous stream of unread text messages from Chloe, the words completely devoid of her usual polished charm. My eyes darted from the frantic screen of my phone back up to the flashing television monitor in the corner, my fingers trembling. I grabbed the small plastic remote resting on the edge of the bar and pressed the volume button. The sudden booming voice of a national news anchor instantly filled the empty hall, entirely replacing the howling winds outside. We are receiving live updates from federal authorities, the anchor announced, his tone grave and urgent. The highly publicized green energy firm, previously hailed as the future of sustainable tech, has just been entirely shut down. The Securities and Exchange Commission, in a joint operation with the Federal Bureau of Investigation, has classified the corporation as a massive, elaborate Ponzi scheme. The chief executive officer, Vance, is accused of defrauding federal subsidy programs and private venture funds out of tens of millions of dollars. Authorities state the supposed solar farms never actually existed. The money was simply being rotated to pay off initial investors while funding an incredibly lavish personal lifestyle. I stood entirely frozen, the heavy glass of whiskey slipping slightly in my sweaty palm, but the real shock had not even registered yet. The broadcast cut from the aerial view of the raided office building to a crisp, professional headshot. The sudden collapse of this fraudulent empire, the anchor continued, was triggered by a comprehensive digital evidence packet submitted by an independent cybersecurity auditor acting as a confidential informant. The face flashing across the national broadcast, identified boldly at the bottom of the screen as the primary whistleblower, belonged to the man standing right beside me. It was Leo. I slowly turned my head. My new husband was leaning against the polished wooden bar, watching the television with the exact same calm, analytical expression he wore when he was diagnosing a server error. He took a slow, measured sip of his drink, placed the glass down, and finally turned to face me. I needed to wait until the ink on our marriage license was completely dry, Leo said, his voice steady, low, and incredibly gentle. I am so sorry I kept you in the dark. Piper. What did you do? I managed to whisper, my vocal cords tight and dry. Leo stepped closer, his presence a solid wall against the spiraling chaos in my mind. About 4 months ago, I noticed something deeply wrong while I was securing our shared home network. Vance had quietly bypassed your personal firewall. He did not just steal your identity, he weaponized it. He harvested your digital signature, your corporate clearance levels at Veritas Freight, and your personal social security details to artificially authorize massive logistical manifests. He was using your spotless professional record to validate the movement of non-existent solar equipment. He was setting you up to be the absolute perfect, oblivious fall guy when the federal agents eventually came knocking. My stomach violently dropped. The man my family worshipped had actively planned to send me to federal prison just to buy himself a few more months of luxury. I have been secretly cooperating with the Federal Cyber Crimes Division ever since that night, Leo continued, his eyes locking fiercely onto mine. I spent hundreds of hours dismantling his encrypted servers, tracing every single stolen dime back to his offshore accounts, and proving beyond any reasonable doubt that you had absolutely zero knowledge of the transactions. The government needed airtight proof. I gave them a titanium vault. Why did you not just tell me? I asked, a wave of dizzying panic washing over me. Because if I told you, your parents would have noticed the shift in your behavior. Leo answered without a second of hesitation. And the absolute second they found out you held the key to destroying their precious golden ticket, they would have relentlessly manipulated you. They would have cried, begged, and emotionally blackmailed you into destroying the evidence and taking the fall to protect Chloe's perfect future. I refused to let them destroy your life. I needed the federal indictment to be completely unstoppable before they even knew what hit them. Before I could process the staggering weight of his protection, my phone violently buzzed again. This time, my thumb slipped, and I accidentally accepted an incoming voicemail from my mother, projecting the audio straight through the speakerphone. Instead of her usual haughty, commanding tone, the sound that tore through the quiet lodge was a hysterical, breathless shrieking. In the background of the audio, I could clearly hear the chaotic smashing of expensive crystal glasses, the frantic shouting of heavy-voiced men, and the blaring wails of multiple police sirens. "Piper!" my mother screamed into the receiver, her voice cracking with raw, unadulterated terror. "Piper, you have to answer the phone right now. We are in Aspen. They ruined everything. Men in tactical gear just stormed the resort ballroom. They pushed past the waitstaff. They kicked down the ice sculpture, and they threw Vance right onto the marble floor. They placed him in handcuffs right in front of the governor and hundreds of our most important guests. Chloe is screaming. The investors are fleeing, and they are seizing everything, Piper. Pick up the phone." The voicemail ended with a sharp, pathetic click, leaving the lodge drowning in a profound, heavy silence once more. I looked down at the dark screen of my phone, then looked up at my husband, the man my family had dismissed as a worthless janitor. He had just burned their false kingdom to the ground, and he had done it all to keep me safe. Exactly 3 days after the blizzard cleared, and we returned from our isolated mountain cabin, a frantic, aggressive pounding rattled the front door of our home. I stood up from the kitchen table, where Leo and I were quietly drinking our morning coffee, and walked down the short hallway. I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the heavy wooden door open. Standing on my front porch, completely stripped of their usual suffocating arrogance, were my parents. They looked absolutely unrecognizable. The shimmering designer evening wear and the meticulously styled hair from their Aspen photos were completely gone. My mother was wearing a wrinkled beige trench coat over a mismatched tracksuit, her face pale and deeply lined, with dark, exhausted bags hanging heavily under her bloodshot eyes. My father stood slightly behind her, his shoulders slumped forward, his hands trembling violently inside his jacket pockets. He looked like a man who had suddenly aged 2 decades in the span of 72 hours. For a brief, foolish fraction of a second, the naive, deeply conditioned child inside of me genuinely thought they had come to apologize. I thought they were standing on my porch to beg for my forgiveness, to explain how incredibly sorry they were for abandoning me in an empty lodge on the most important day of my life. I was completely wrong. "Do you have any idea what your husband has done?" my mother hissed, her voice shaking with raw, unfiltered venom as she aggressively pushed past me and stepped into my living room without an invitation. "Do you have any concept of the absolute devastation he has caused? He has completely destroyed your sister's future." I closed the front door slowly, the heavy click of the latch echoing loudly in the tense space. I turned around and stared at the woman who gave birth to me. "My husband just saved me from going to a federal penitentiary," I said, my voice shockingly calm, completely devoid of the panic she clearly expected to see. "Vance forged my signature. He stole my identity to launder his stolen money. Leo protected me." "Oh, please, Piper," my mother screamed, throwing her hands up in the air in a theatrical display of extreme frustration. "Vance is a visionary. The paperwork was just a temporary misunderstanding, a minor administrative shortcut because his legal team was moving too slowly. He would have eventually cleared your name." But Leo deliberately called the federal authorities out of sheer, petty jealousy. He could not handle standing next to a real man who actually provides for his family, so he burned Chloe's entire life to the ground. I stared at her, the sheer audacity of her delusion rendering me momentarily speechless. She was actively defending a criminal who tried to frame her eldest daughter, entirely because that criminal drove an expensive car and bought her expensive champagne. Before I could tell her to get out of my house, my father suddenly collapsed. His knees buckled, hitting the hardwood floor with a loud, painful thud. He buried his face in his trembling hands and began to sob, emitting loud, ragged gasps that tore through the quiet room. "Dad," I asked, a sudden cold spike of genuine alarm piercing through my anger. "What is going on?" He looked up at me, his eyes wide and thoroughly terrified. "We lost it. Piper," he choked out, the words tumbling rapidly from his mouth in a desperate, pathetic rush. "We lost absolutely everything. The government agents froze all of his assets. They locked down the corporate accounts, the personal accounts, the shell companies. Everything is gone." "You did not invest any money," I stated, a deep, sickening dread beginning to pool in the pit of my stomach. "You barely had enough in your savings account to cover your monthly utilities. I know exactly what your finances look like because I have been balancing your checkbook for the last 10 years. Vance offered us a private, friends and family buy-in rate," my father cried out, completely ignoring my logic. "He told us that if we could just secure the capital, he would guarantee us a 1% ownership stake in his new solar grid expansion, 1% of a billion-dollar company." Piper. We would have been set for the rest of our lives. We would have never needed to ask you for another dime. The room suddenly felt incredibly small, the air growing dangerously thin. "Where did you get the money?" I asked, my voice dropping to a terrifyingly quiet whisper. My father could not even look me in the eye. He stared fixedly at the floorboards, right beside his knees. "We went to the bank," he mumbled. "We took out a second mortgage. We gave Vance a cashier's check for $200,000. The entire world seemed to forcefully halt on its axis. My ears began to ring with a sharp, high-pitched whine. "You mortgaged the house?" I asked, emphasizing every single syllable, my tone sharp enough to cut solid glass. "The house that I spent 5 grueling years working 70-hour weeks to pay off for you, the house I sacrificed my own 20s to secure so you would not face foreclosure. You secretly signed it away to a con artist for $200,000. "It was supposed to be a sure thing," my mother yelled defensively, stepping forward to shield my weeping father. "He promised us massive returns within 6 months, and now it is all gone because your spiteful husband handed over those hard drives. But we can still fix this. You can still fix this. Piper?" She grabbed my forearm, her painted fingernails digging sharply into my skin. Her eyes were wide, frantic, and filled with a horrifying, desperate madness. "You need to bring Leo out here right now," she commanded, her voice dropping into a frantic, conspiratorial whisper. "You need to make him call the federal prosecutor immediately. Tell Leo to claim that his cybersecurity audit was flawed. Tell him to say the firewall data was somehow corrupted by a malicious virus, that he made a massive technical error, and that Vance is completely innocent. If Leo retracts the digital evidence, the case will fall apart. Vance will be released. He will get his assets unfrozen, and he will give us our $200,000 back. We can save the house. We can save your sister's engagement." I looked down at the woman gripping my arm. I looked at the man weeping pathetically on my living room rug. I looked closely at the people who had raised me, the people I had bled myself completely dry to support. In that precise, crystal-clear moment, a massive, crushing weight instantly lifted off my shoulders. I saw them not as my parents, but as the parasitic strangers they truly were. They did not care that I had spent my wedding day crying in an empty room. They did not care that Vance had actively orchestrated a plan to send me to a federal prison. They only cared about maintaining their superficial status and retrieving the money they had thrown into a burning pit of greed. They never loved me. They only loved what I could continually provide for them. I calmly reached down, grabbed my mother's wrist, and forcefully peeled her fingers off my arm. I took one deliberate step backward, creating a permanent, unbridgeable physical and emotional distance between us. "Get out," I said quietly. "Piper, please," my father wailed from the floor, reaching a desperate hand toward my ankle. "They are going to take the house." "Then you had better start packing," I replied, my voice completely devoid of any emotion, cold and impenetrable as solid steel. "Because my husband is not changing a single word of his report, and I am no longer paying for your mistakes." I turned my back on them, walked directly to the front door, and pulled it wide open. "Get out of my house," I repeated, my tone echoing with absolute, terrifying finality. My mother glared at me with pure, unadulterated hatred. Realizing her control over me had just completely evaporated, she grabbed my father by his collar, roughly hauling him up to his feet. Without another word, they stumbled out onto the front porch, two pathetic shadows of their former selves. I did not wait for them to reach the sidewalk. I forcefully slammed the heavy wooden door shut behind them and sharply turned the deadbolt lock. The loud metallic click echoed through the silent hallway, permanently severing every last illusion of family I had ever held on to. In the immediate aftermath of the raid, my younger sister did exactly what she had been training her entire life to do. She weaponized her tears. While I was securely locking my doors and permanently cutting ties with our parents, Chloe was aggressively booking highly publicized appearances on every single major daytime television network. She wore muted, conservative sweaters, completely stripped her face of heavy makeup to appear pale and fragile, and stared directly into the television camera lenses with wide, falsely traumatized eyes. To the millions of viewers watching from their living rooms, she spun a magnificent, heartbreaking narrative of a naive, trusting young woman utterly deceived by a monstrous financial mastermind. But she did not stop at simply playing the devastated victim. She desperately needed a scapegoat to deflect the intense public and legal scrutiny, and she aimed her perfectly manicured finger directly at my husband. Leo was always so bitterly jealous of Vance. Chloe sobbed gracefully during a highly rated morning talk show interview, dabbing her perfectly dry eyes with a white tissue. He lived in a tiny, pathetic shack in the woods. He could not stand seeing my fiancé build an actual empire. I believe, deep down in my heart, that Leo maliciously fabricated those digital reports just to destroy our happiness out of pure spite. Her performance was a terrifying masterclass in public manipulation. Almost overnight, the media narrative aggressively shifted. The tabloid press, always incredibly hungry for a dramatic family feud, eagerly latched onto the jealous brother-in-law angle. Within 48 hours, my quiet, highly structured life at Veritas Freight Solutions turned into an absolute waking nightmare. Sleazy reporters with massive telephoto lenses began camping out in the employee parking lot 24 hours a day. They hurled aggressive, humiliating questions at me as I walked to my car, asking loudly if my husband was a criminal hacker, asking if I was violently bitter that my sister was wealthier than me, and asking if we were actively trying to extort her for settlement money. My corporate supervisors eventually had to hire private security guards just to escort me safely into the main lobby, my professional sanctuary, the one place where I was genuinely valued for my sharp mind and not my wallet, was being systematically invaded and destroyed. But while Chloe was excessively busy securing her shiny new status as a national martyr, Leo was quietly doing exactly what he did best. He was hunting in the dark. It happened at exactly 3 o'clock in the morning, nearly a week after the disastrous wedding day. I was staring blankly at the dark bedroom ceiling when Leo gently pushed the heavy wooden door open. The bright, bluish glow from his hallway office illuminated the deep, heavy exhaustion visibly etched into his features, but his eyes were blazing with a terrifying electric intensity. "I finally cracked the ghost server," he said, his voice dropping to a low, rough whisper. "You need to come into the office right now. You need to see this." I quickly threw off the thick wool blankets and followed him down the short hallway. His massive dual desktop monitors were glowing brightly, displaying endless, rapid scrolling lines of decrypted text and retrieved data files. When the federal agents had raided the corporate headquarters in Aspen, they had physically seized all the main hardware. But Leo, being the meticulous architect of the initial security audit, had quietly maintained a mirrored backup of a heavily encrypted, localized hard drive that Vance kept hidden on a secondary private network. It took Leo over 120 hours of relentless brute force decrypting to break the final security firewall. "Chloe is telling the entire world she had absolutely no idea the company was a fraudulent sham," Leo said, his fingers flying rapidly across the mechanical keyboard. He clicked open a recovered, heavily encrypted email thread. "Read the dates on these messages." I leaned forward, my tired eyes scanning the bright digital screen. The emails were dated exactly 6 months ago, long before the lavish engagement party was ever announced, long before my foolish parents secretly mortgaged their home. The thread was a direct, highly private conversation between Vance and an anonymous administrative account that Leo had definitively traced back to Chloe's personal internet protocol address. I read the words, and the blood rushing through my veins turned to absolute freezing ice. Chloe was not a blind, innocent victim. She was the active co-architect of my destruction. The messages clearly and clinically outlined the massive financial deficits in the fake solar project. Vance was panicking, complaining bitterly that the federal subsidy auditors were getting way too close and actively demanding verified logistical manifests to prove the green energy equipment was actually moving across state lines. He desperately needed a registered corporate logistics executive to sign off on the fake cargo routes, but he was terrified of hiring an outside contractor who might ask dangerous questions. Then, I saw my younger sister's reply. "Just use Piper. Chloe had typed casually. She is a senior analyst at Veritas. She has the exact high-level security clearances you need to bypass the initial government flags. Just clone her digital signature. She is incredibly stupid. She is obsessed with her boring job, and she is always blindly loyal to the family. If the federal agents ever look into it, they will just assume she made a massive clerical error. She will take the fall for us, and by the time she figures it out, we will be living safely in Switzerland. My own sister, the girl I had shared a childhood bedroom with, the girl whose expensive college tuition I had willingly helped pay for, had actively and enthusiastically volunteered me to be the sacrificial lamb for a multi-million-dollar federal crime. She had looked at my unwavering, lifelong loyalty and decided it was the absolute perfect weapon to completely destroy me. I can send this directly to the lead federal investigator right now, Leo said, his voice tightening with intense, barely suppressed rage. I can have armed federal marshals dragging her out of her television studio by noon today. I stared blankly at the glowing screen, reading her callous, hateful words over and over again until they were permanently burned into my retinas. The sudden anger that rose inside of me was not hot, loud, or explosive. It was devastatingly cold, highly precise, and completely absolute. No, I said softly, stepping slowly back from the monitors. If we just hand this evidence over to the police, she will find a sneaky way to spin it. She will cry and claim her account was hacked. She will hire expensive lawyers and delay the federal trials for years. The tabloid media will just eat it up and continue to give her the spotlight she craves. I looked over at my husband, the only true family I had left in this entire world. Gigai. Download absolutely everything onto a secure portable drive, I instructed him, my voice steady, deep, and completely unwavering. Do not give it to the press. Do not give it to the police. I am going to end this myself, and I'm going to do it in a way she can never, ever recover from. The municipal courthouse was an imposing structure of cold gray stone and heavy mahogany doors. It was a Tuesday morning, exactly 3 weeks after the federal raid, and the city council had convened a highly publicized, live-streamed public hearing. The objective was to assess the staggering financial damages and begin establishing a compensation fund for the dozens of defrauded investors. Every single major news network had set up their heavy broadcast cameras in the back of the cavernous room. The gallery was packed shoulder to shoulder with angry, desperate people. Sitting at the front plaintiff table was my sister. She had meticulously dressed for the role of the ultimate tragic heroine. She wore a modest, faded beige cardigan, her hair pulled back into a messy, unassuming bun. She kept her head bowed, occasionally dabbing her dry eyes with a crumpled tissue. Sitting right behind her in the gallery were my parents, looking utterly defeated but clinging desperately to the false hope that Chloe's performance would somehow secure a massive victim settlement to save their heavily mortgaged house. Chloe slowly approached the microphone, clutching a piece of paper, her voice trembling perfectly as she prepared to deliver her heartbreaking victim impact statement. She never got the chance to read a single word. The heavy wooden double doors at the back of the chamber swung open. The room fell entirely silent as Leo and I walked down the center aisle. I did not look at my parents. I did not sit in the gallery. I walked directly past the heavy wooden barrier and approached the council podium. The presiding judge, a stern-looking woman with silver hair, frowned and asked for my name and purpose. I leaned into the microphone. My name is Piper Payne, I stated clearly, my voice ringing out across the silent, packed courtroom. I am not here as a member of the defendant's family. I am formally registering as the primary victim of corporate identity theft, and I have material evidence to submit directly to this council and the federal prosecutors present in this room. I did not raise my voice. I did not hurl insults. The burning anger that had consumed me for the past month had completely hardened into cold, impenetrable clarity. I reached into my leather bag and pulled out a small, silver-encrypted hard drive, handing it over to the court clerk. For the past 3 weeks, Chloe Payne has publicly claimed she was completely blind to the fraudulent activities of her fiancé, I said, looking directly at the row of flashing camera lenses. The drive I just submitted contains the original, decrypted internal server communications from the fake Solar Corporation. Specifically, it contains a verified email thread dated exactly 6 months before the federal indictments. I pulled a printed copy of the emails from my pocket and read Chloe's exact words out loud into the microphone. I read how she explicitly instructed her partner to steal my digital signature. I read how she called me stupid and blindly loyal. I outlined, methodically and clinically, the precise timeline of how she actively participated in laundering the stolen funds through my logistical clearances, deliberately planning to send her own sister to a federal penitentiary to protect her luxury lifestyle. The silence in the massive room was absolute, suffocating, and incredibly heavy. And then, the pristine, delicate mask my sister had spent her entire life perfecting violently shattered. Chloe lunged forward, her chair screeching harshly against the polished floor. She began to scream. It was not a graceful, television-ready cry. It was a vicious, feral, completely out-of-control shriek. She hurled vile, profanity-laced insults at me, violently swiping a heavy glass water pitcher off the defense table. The glass shattered everywhere. 2 armed bailiffs immediately rushed forward, grabbing her arms and physically restraining her as she thrashed and kicked wildly. Her true, ugly, vicious nature was completely exposed, broadcast live in high definition to millions of viewers. I turned my head slightly to look at the gallery. My mother and father were completely frozen, their faces drained of all color, their mouths hanging slightly open. The horrible truth finally crashed down heavily upon them. The golden child they had worshipped, the daughter they had sacrificed my entire life to elevate, was the exact same person who had knowingly dragged them into absolute financial ruin and homelessness. They had traded their reliable, loving daughter for a ruthless parasite, and now they were left with absolutely nothing. I did not stay to watch the bailiffs drag my screaming sister out of the room. Leo placed his warm, sturdy hand on the small of my back, and together, we turned and walked back down the long center aisle. As we pushed through the heavy courthouse doors and stepped out into the bright, blinding sunlight, a massive swarm of reporters instantly surrounded us, their camera flashes exploding like lightning. We completely ignored their shouted questions. Suddenly, a frantic voice called out over the chaos. "Piper, Piper, wait." My mother was pushing desperately through the crowd of journalists, her hair wild, tears streaming down her panicked face. She grabbed the door handle of Leo's battered, reliable old pickup truck just as I opened it. "Piper, please," she begged, her voice cracking with pathetic desperation. "The bank is foreclosing on the house on Friday. We have absolutely nowhere to go. You have to help us. We are your family." I stopped. I looked at the woman who had happily abandoned my wedding for a glass of champagne. I smiled. A genuine, completely peaceful smile. "Mom," I said softly, ensuring she heard every single word. "I am the older sister. I have already yielded the stage to her. You are her audience now." I pulled the truck door shut, the solid metallic thud blocking out her frantic wails. I looked at Leo, nodded once, and he drove us away, leaving the wreckage of my former life shrinking rapidly in the rearview mirror. That evening, our small wooden cabin was completely quiet, save for the gentle crackling of the warm fireplace. I stood in the center of our living room, holding a simple wooden frame. Inside the frame was the very first photograph taken on my wedding day. It was a picture of me, standing in my simple white dress, holding a glass of whiskey, with Leo standing right by my side. In the background, softly out of focus, were 40 perfectly empty wooden chairs adorned with sage green ribbons. I drove a small nail into the wooden wall and carefully hung the picture right above the mantel. I stepped back and admired it. It was no longer a painful reminder of betrayal or abandonment. It was a beautiful, triumphant monument to the exact day the heavy chains finally broke, the day the toxic dead weight was cut loose, and the day I was finally, truly free. Thank you so much for listening to today's story. We hope you enjoyed it, as an ad-free channel. Your support is what keeps us alive. Please support Maya Revenge Stories with just $1 via the QR code on the screen, or click the link in the description box or pinned comment. Also, we'd love to connect with you. Please leave a comment telling us which city or state you're listening from. Thank you for standing with us, and see you in the next stories.